Hey y'all, I'm Leslie Hooper and welcome to my YouTube channel.
And I'm Steph Miramontes.
Today I wanted to spend a few minutes reacting to a recent interview on Stephen Bartlett's The Diary of CEO. And he actually has Johann Hari, who is a New York Times best-selling author, on his podcast. And this guy recently wrote a book on, it's titled Magic Pill: The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. And so, Steph, we've been talking about Ozempic on this channel a little bit more recently, and we actually have an upcoming podcast interview on the Outsmart Overeating podcast where we're going to be featuring 3 of our clients who have done both the Unstuffed program and Ozempic, and we're going to be getting their perspective on that. So for our viewers, stay tuned. I'm excited to have that conversation with them. But I thought that this might be an interesting message to share with our viewers.
What I most hope is that A, the drugs don't have a catastrophic side effect, obviously. B, the people who want them get them. And C, it wakes us up and we go, how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where we're looking at potentially drugging our children forever, not knowing the long-term effects? Who did this to us, and how can we be more like Japan and all the other countries that are making these changes? Now, that's optimistic. That requires a lot of raising of consciousness between now and then, but that's the most optimistic scenario for me. But you're totally right. There could be a scenario, it's probably the most likely scenario if there isn't some big risk that emerges, that we'll just have staggering amounts of the population taking these drugs.
Unless the government intervene, that feels like the most likely scenario. Unless the government introduce some laws that put restrictions on what children can eat at school and all those kinds of things in a more severe way, I can't see a scenario where, especially with this younger generation, you hear all these stats around young girls on TikTok being more anxious than ever before, the suicidality going up. Men are struggling more than ever with body dysmorphia, which no one's talking about. I was reading some stats about that yesterday.
Yeah, it's shocking, the figures on that.
And the antidote appears to be, this.
It's not a good solution, right?
And perfectly normal, healthy people who just have a little bit of belly fat. And they hear this, they hear about this stuff. They go, going to the gym is hard, and I do love those burgers, and that KFC is really nice. It does taste really good. So I could eat my KFC and I could stay skinny.
Well, if they think that last bit, then they're wrong. If you take it, you won't want to eat the KFC and the burgers. And believe me, I have been the king of KFC. So the last bit's wrong. But I think, it's one of the things, it's funny, it's one of the things that made me really angry in Japan. I was thinking, all this agonizing I've done, all this worrying, and I worry even more about the fact we're almost certainly about to start a mass wave of drugging children with Ozempic. Already begun in the US. I interviewed parents who are drugging their kids because their children are obese. And I thought this whole dilemma never had to happen, right? This happened because the food industry screwed us over and we didn't regulate them and we didn't stop them. And we can start to do that. And I went to places that have done it. I went to Mexico where they introduced a sugar tax, hugely reduced the amount of sugar that people consume. I went to Minneapolis where they prescribe healthy food for poorer people who can't afford it. Has a really positive effect. I went to Finland where they had a huge transformation in the food supply. There's so much we can do. There's so much we can do to be like Japan. It was a bit weird in Japan though, because there were things they did that we can't do, right? So I'll give you an example. This was one of the weirdest days in the research for the book. In 2008, obesity very slightly went up in Japan. It was still like laughably low. And they had a real panic and they introduced this new law. It's called the Metabo Law. It's named after metabolic syndrome, which is a really nasty combination of like diabetes, obesity, and other problems you can get when you're very overweight. And the law is very simple. Every single company in Japan on a particular day every year has to weigh every single person who works there. And if their weight has gone up, they have to draw up a plan with their employer to bring their weight down. And as a company, overall, if your weight goes up, you can be fined by the government. And I was like, how could this possibly work? So I went to a company that does it, Tanita. They all do it, but a company that let me go and see how it works. And it's really weird, right? You in this workplace, you arrive, you show your face to a video screen. It says, "Hi, Stephen. You walked 14,000 steps yesterday. You're number 121 in the company in terms of steps taken," because everyone has to wear like a Fitbit or the equivalent to a Fitbit. Everyone uploads pictures of every meal they have to this system where you can see it. It was bizarre, right? And yeah, explaining to the Japanese people who kept going, every morning in this office when we'd all be having donuts and coffee, they do aerobics together. It was bizarre. And I would sort of explain to these Japanese people, right, if you tried to do this in Britain, we would burn the fucking office down, right? And they would just go, well, why? Why? They couldn't understand why I was so affronted by it. And that's a big cultural chasm. And we can't do that. And I wouldn't want us to do that. But if you look at so many of the other changes in Japan, I started to see what you win if you get this right. So Japan has the longest life expectancy in the whole world. And one of the best things I did for the book, one of the most moving things for me, is I went to the oldest village in the whole world. It's in Okinawa in the deep south of Japan. And there's a village called Ogimi where there's 215 households and 190 of them have someone who's over the age of 90 living there, right? So it's the oldest place on earth. Japan has by far the longest life expectancy in the world. And not just that, you're far less likely to get sick as you age. So they have not just more life, but more healthy life. And I went to their little community center. And the first person I met was a 102-year-old woman called Matsu Fukuchi, who was this almost like this kind of perfect crumple of wrinkles, right? She was so cheerful chatting to her. She was like, "Oh, I can't stay for long because I'm looking after my son who fell off the roof the other day, fixing it." I was like, "Jesus, how old is your son?" And she was like, "Oh, I love," she was so full of joy. She's like, "I love life. I spent all of yesterday watching volleyball with my grandchildren. It's so great." She was so happy. She'd walk there on her own. And then there was this moment where they put on some music. She put on this red kimono and she started dancing. And all these women as old as a century start dancing, right? And I danced with her. And I was thinking, God, this woman was born before radio started broadcasting in Japan. And here I am recording an interview with her on my iPhone. This is what you get if you get this right. If you sort out the obesity crisis, you get to have more years of health and joy and dancing, right? That's what we're fighting for here. I think about how many people I know who died young because of complications related to obesity. And it doesn't have to be this way. Now part of that solution in the short and medium term is going to be these drugs. In the longer term, it doesn't have to even be that, right? Japan is a real country. It exists. They solved this problem. There are other countries in the world that are solving these problems. We don't have to tolerate this being done to our children. We don't have to accept us being made sick and our children being made sick. But it requires an awakening around what's really happening.
Okay, I know that there's a lot to unpack there, so we'll really just primarily focus maybe on the children element and Japan culture. That is a bit wild, isn't it? So different than how we do things here in the States and Britain, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't know that I love a company-wide weigh-in. I guess it's not as offensive if everybody's doing it, but it just brings me back to my childhood trauma of being weighed in gym class in front of everyone and, feeling all bad. And weight in and of itself is just not the only indicator of health and well-being and all the things. And so I'm not sure I'm down for that. What I am down for, though, is a cultural shift where walkability is so much more convenient, kind of like it is in New York and Europe. And, these community pods where you can walk to the grocery store and grab what you need for the day instead of these big bulk shopping trips where you're buying, massive boxes of candy bars and triple packs of family-sized potato chips and stuff. Like anybody even fucking needs that shit. But if it's there, you're going to eat it all day, every day. It's not that there's anything wrong with these foods, but when you buy them en masse, and we live in a culture where we don't really understand our emotions, our emotional ties to eating and things like that. So now we are being controlled by our environment and our environmental triggers, because we're not sitting around thinking, what could I do when I'm bored? Oh, I could walk to the grocery store and grab my groceries for the day, you know, kind of thing. So I think there are some structures that could be built in here that would both help with just changing the environment for us as adults and also for kids. And when they kind of talk about the kids, and now we have like the elite squad and these adults losing weight and all the things, and then we're drugging our kids and stuff, my thought immediately was that research that you've talked about several times about how if you have one obese parent, chances are pretty high that you're going to have a child who is also obese. And if you have two obese parents, then the chances are almost 100%. I mean, it's just so high. And so I really do think that the problem can be solved at the adult level in so many ways. So if we took some environmental changes and we took solving the problem at the adult level, and somebody came in and therapied our asses like we need to be with our emotional overeating shit that we have going on, then yeah. But here's what I know, that will never stand. Like, not in the US, I doubt in the UK. We can see some shifts and changes. And I would love the fantasy of being like, okay, nobody's craving KFC every single day anymore. Nobody's craving fast food every single day anymore. Ozempic has washed our brains of our, you know, compulsive desire to overeat fast food or whatever. That's a great fantasy to think that if on a global level or on a national level, we see enough behavioral shift that the companies start to suffer if they don't change the way that they're doing things. If they don't shift, it's like, hey, nobody's buying fried chicken. They're not going to fry up a bunch of chicken anymore. Like, it's going to start to shift. Just kind of like how eaters are now being accommodated in fast food places because more people are going plant-based. They're like, well, they're not coming for hamburgers anymore. We got to have Impossible burgers or, you know, whatever. There is an opportunity for shift here. I think that's a real big optimistic view and a very long-term one to see the trickle effects of what happens.
Yeah. Well, when you watch the entire interview, they do talk about how stock is starting to plummet in certain areas like Nestle chocolate and other food-related places. Individuals who have knee replacements, I guess part of whatever they use in the knee as the replacement, stock market is starting to plummet because it doesn't need to sustain the same amount of weight anymore. So there's already some early signs shifting. One thing that they also talk about is how 47% of Americans polled said that they would take Ozempic. And that's, to Stephen's previous point, using an injectable, not even the pill. And so I imagine if that's the case, then things will shift even more. So it is interesting to see how this is going to play out over the long term. But the Japanese are certainly doing a lot of things well, although things that will not ever fly here in the quote unquote land of the free. I can already hear the outrage. Like, the pushback would just be, and I don't think it needs to be that extreme either. I'm with you. I don't think that I need the government monitoring how many steps I take in a day and then punishing me or threatening my job or whatever if I'm not checking those boxes or sending the pictures of my food to the government. Also sounds very unusual. But culturally, it's not just Japan that has a lot of this figured out, and in terms of the habits and what they value. If you just turn your attention towards France, right? Also over there, their eating habits are very different. They think about it differently. And that's kind of to your point, is there's just a different relationship with food. I think I'm curious for your thoughts on this. How much do you think Japan is using fear tactics? Or is it like a legitimate, everybody's on board, kind of what he was saying, and they don't see it as threatening or unusual or weird. It's just kind of normal. Like, I don't know, putting on your seatbelt when you get in your car kind of thing.
I don't feel qualified to answer that question because I know so little. However, I will say that based on just the one data point that he brought up, where Japan has a very low obesity rate, and they had a bump, and that bump was still extremely low, like laughably low in comparison to everything else. I really would say it's more of a just lifestyle that supports healthy habits and behaviors, or at least low BMI habits and behaviors. I don't know whether or not they're all healthy, but I think that culturally there's probably something built in there that keeps those numbers as low as they are. And then their desire to take fast action when they notice the shift was probably pretty helpful and beneficial. But of course there's fear there, you know, I mean, but that's with everything. That's with every change that anyone ever makes ever. We are much more motivated by fear, pain, and suffering than we are happy-go-lucky feel-goods.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when he mentioned that in America, or in his case, maybe Britain, you know, people are having coffee and donuts, and they're all doing an aerobics class together at work in the morning. That would definitely be different for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on this to our viewers. I mean, is this something that you're concerned about, children beginning to use Ozempic? What's that going to look like in the future? How do you think culturally we're going to see this shift? Is it something that you're currently considering, or are you using Ozempic? I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments. And hey, if you found this video useful and you'd like more, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button on your way out, and we will see you on the next one, y'all.